Hi everyone, welcome to our podcast, Goth Nick and Goth Chick. It's a working title. This will be the pilot episode where we discuss the Gothic more generally. My name is Nick Vanderwaard. I'm a Gothicist. I studied Gothic media at Manchester Metropolitan University in Manchester, England. I studied a lot of different aspects of the Gothic, but I specialized in video games, specifically Metroidvania.
And I'm Lindsay Wheeler. So I'm a biological scientist with a focus on invertebrates, which might seem like an odd choice for a co-host on a podcast about the Gothic and media, but Nick and I have had many a very engaging conversation about these topics, and we've really enjoyed how these conversations have gone. We really get into the weeds about some of these details and thought that it was worth recording and sharing. That's
fair. So, basically the Gothicist being me, and Lindsay is someone who's interested in the Gothic and is able to provide some interesting insights from a biological standpoint. So, anytime we're talking about animals or monsters that have animal-like qualities, expect some interesting feedback from Lindsay as far as that goes.
Especially if it's bugs.
Bugs, especially. Yeah. So this podcast, for the time being, will just be available on YouTube, but maybe later on, if we can expand it and find a place to host it specifically, apart from YouTube, I can plug that here. But for right now, this podcast will just be available on YouTube. This first pilot episode will be discussing the Gothic more generally. We'll be outlining what it is according to some of its definitive qualities, which we'll discuss right now.
So, what makes something Gothic?
What makes something Gothic? There's a list of criteria, general criteria that you can apply to just about anything, any kind of media, or even real-life events. But sticking with media...
Like literature, film,
video games, music, books.
Yeah.
There are different aspects of the Gothic that you can identify easily enough. So you have the abject, you have the uncanny, and you have ontology. You also have, in terms of presentation, horror and terror. And there are a lot of different tropes that you can sort of isolate, such as doubles, live burial, incest, perfidiousness, and that can be applied to anything, though, in certain Gothic periods, things like that. And those are literary tropes that can tie up into some of these various things like the uncanny or the abject or the numinous or ontological ideas. And then atmosphere to something like the numinous or the weird or the sublime. These are different things that you can communicate primarily through atmosphere, as in you feel them more than you experience them directly, and that's a big part of the Gothic. I guess the last sort of aspect that I haven't really talked about is oscillation. Generally in the Gothic, it tends to upend or ignore binaries in favor of a gray area in the middle. So anytime you have good versus evil, or ugly versus beautiful, or monstrous versus not monstrous, normal versus alien, or normal versus abnormal, foreign versus familiar, anything like that you can think of, the Gothic tends to do less with one versus the other and more of sort of that area in the middle. And it's very, very typical to have a story where things might appear normal at first glance, but then you're indicating that something is monstrous without having everything become fully monstrous either. You're kind of stuck in the middle. You have so many stories about kids in suburban neighborhoods where the vampire moves in next door, and then you're not sure if he's good or evil, and they can sort of play off that idea in various ways, but generally there's no resolution to the weirdness. Because even if you unveil that the vampire is a good vampire and not an evil, bad vampire like in Fright Night, where the vampiric neighbor is, in fact, up to no good, there's still no happy resolution. He's still a vampire, so it's not like everything is... It's not like the Munsters or
like the Scooby-Doo big reveal at the end of the episode kind of thing.
Yeah, or where you can explain the supernatural elements and everything kind of fades away into normality, whereas the Addams family is still the Addams family. They're still weird.
Yeah.
They're still unusual. And no matter what type of resolution you have, or if Velma shows up and says, okay, gang, here's what happened, in those stories, there's just a complete, total happy ending. But for the Gothic to persist, or for the Gothic to be the Gothic, you tend not to have that. Or you're left with some kind of sinking feeling at the end. And there's different ways that you can go about that, too. The lack of resolution after the story's over, where they just killed Jason, or they sent him to hell, or whatever. And then at the very end, his hand rises out of the grave to imply that he's not dead.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there are different ways that you can imply that a lack of resolution has been attained. So yeah, those components are kind of what make the Gothic, as opposed to not being Gothic, I guess.
Right.
And, apart from that, because these are really broad fields, too. Because you have plenty of people that spend their entire lives in academia just writing about the uncanny. And it doesn't just have to be in Gothic stories, because you have the uncanny in robotics, for instance, or you have the uncanny in animation more generally. You probably have heard of the Uncanny Valley,
mm-hmm.
where in robotics they might try and make a robot that looks human. And in order for that to work, you have to get past the Uncanny Valley. It has to pass a certain kind of basic test of recognition, where you don't feel creeped out when you look at it like you would with a clown or...
Well, like with the Uncanny Valley, it's usually... there's been an effort to make it look normal, but it just doesn't quite get there, as opposed to no effort whatsoever.
Yeah, with the uncanny, that's essentially how it works, like from a visual standpoint,
mm-hmm.
where you have a human face that's kind of cartoonish. It's not trying to appear real. And then you have something like Robert Zemeckis' The Polar Express, which is kind of infamous for having these semi-realistic faces, but then the eyes are completely dead and glassy. And that creates an uncanny effect. And generally it's unintentional. Except in Gothic stories, it would be very intentional. Like, how can you deliberately create feelings of the uncanny? And how can you deliberately create feelings of some of the other things that we mentioned, like the abject, or ontology, or any type of atmosphere that is prevalent in Gothic stories, like the numinous, or the weird.
And, I guess, we could spend a whole episode just talking about each of those qualities, but is there any way we could just kind of summarize or give examples of things like the numinous, the abject?
Yeah, just examples of these. Yeah, sure. So, ontology refers to the idea that something is... it doesn't belong to the past, but it doesn't belong to the present. It's kind of a linguistic thought experiment where you're trying to describe, using symbols or things that people might identify with the past. You're creating something that never existed in the past. And even if you're trying to recreate a past event, it's still a present version of something that's like, it's a reimagining of the past using past language. And it doesn't really belong to the present because it's from a past system of language. It's antiquated, it's anachronistic. But it also doesn't belong to the past because the things you're describing never happened the way that you're describing them. There's a sense of like displacement, and you're kind of in this liminal state, neither here nor there. And some good examples of that, just any Gothic story that has a haunted castle. Dracula. All right, Dracula, there was the historic figure Vlad Tepes, who later became known as Dracula, at least according to the Hollywood treatment of him, isn't historically accurate, but it also doesn't feel like something that belongs in the present either. It's just, it's it was made in the 1930s with Bela Lugosi. At least I think it was the 1930s. I might be getting the date wrong, but it doesn't matter. The point is that it was made in the 20th century, whereas the historical figure, Vlad the Impaler, he was earlier in history. And there's a sense of, with Bela Lugosi and that version of Dracula, like that almost belongs somewhere else. There's a sense of the other about it relative to the past. It can be a little bit tricky when you have, like, Anne Rice's vampires, which tend to be much more modernized in their appearance. Like, you need, like, past symbols and things. You need houses that are full of old, strange relics and oil paintings that come alive and walking suits of armor. Castlevania is a great example of that from a video game standpoint, because you have this castle that never existed. It's just a fantasy. It's a fantasy castle, but it's full of all these creatures of myth, and it's full of all of these Gothic symbols and things that basically go all the way back to Horace Walpole and his Gothic novella, The Castle of Otranto, which was a castle that was just full of all of these old symbols and artifacts that were meant to reference an older time. But point in fact, that type of history never existed. The past aesthetic is displaced from actual history. So the Dark Ages actually existed, and the symbols are meant to evoke the darkness of the Dark Ages without actually being attached to them. It's almost like false advertising. There's something about it that is kind of true, even if it's just the fear of a former time. Video games or movies, anything that has like a house that's full of old shit, that usually is symbolic of monsters. Or Castlevania, castle plus Transylvania. Transylvania being like this fantastical older place, this other place, but an older place.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how ontology works. And at least from a Gothic standpoint, that's how it's occurred historically. The uncanny, you experience that. Robots and just the cartoonish presentation of something being uncanny. Those same principles that make a robot uncanny or a cartoon uncanny also apply to Gothic situations. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Thing, where you have an alien menace that is trying to imitate its human host. They get most of it right, but there's just something missing. And sometimes it isn't quite as obvious as you might think. It's not like a clown where the uncanny is like very front and center, because sometimes the imitation is perfect in the sense of they got the physical exterior, like they didn't get anything wrong, so you're looking at the actual human face, but there's just something not there through their personality, their affect, the way that they communicate like emotionally with you. And
mannerisms.
Yeah. Mannerisms, or they would never say that.
Yeah.
Why is he so happy? Or why is he not happy? You know, it really depends on the individual. But the uncanny can be either of those things. It can be something subtle, or it can be something more extreme. Like certain uncanny monsters, Frankenstein's monster, the one thing that they really got wrong, Victor Frankenstein got wrong with the creature, were his eyes. Where they just, there was something very, very wrong about them. And I can't remember the specific description, but it was almost like they didn't have any irises or pupils. They were just white, like pure white. And it was like he was looking at a corpse. And even though everything else was made to be beautiful, there was this one aspect that threw everything off. And that's essentially how the uncanny works. It's like you get mostly everything right, but there's just something wrong, and you can't put your finger on it. And again, that plays into the same types of settings sometimes, where you have you can have a person be uncanny, or you can have a home being uncanny, because the term uncanny comes from German unheimlich, which just means unhomely. So Freud's version of the uncanny was unheimlich, home, domestic, and there's something sort of foreign or unhomely about it. But how that manifests, again, it can be someone who's familiar to you in a domestic sense, like, oh, hey, it's my neighbor, Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, where the zombie episode where Homer shoots Ned Flanders because he was a zombie at that point. And that would be the post-apocalyptic or the George Romero version of the uncanny, where the uncanny occurs in a zombie-like scenario. But generally a sense of invasion or that feeling of the normal being invaded in a subtle kind of way. But it can also be really not so subtle. It's very creepy.
Yeah.
The whole point of the uncanny is it's meant to, unlike the ontological, is meant to make you feel like you're not in the right time. The uncanny is meant to creep you out. And games like Silent Hill are a really good example of that, or Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. I'm trying to think of some other examples.
Well, before we get too far down the road with the uncanny, what about things like the abject and the numinous?
Right. So the abject, it's an idea that, at least in academic circles, was made famous by, her name was Julia Kristeva, and she wrote a piece called The Powers of Horror, where she talks about the process of abjection. To abject something means to throw it off of oneself. It's not a very common verb. I've never heard anyone say, oh, I'm going to abject this. But the idea of, in order for the normal to exist, you have to throw all of these things off of it. Like in order for someone to appear a certain way, they can't be these other things.
Okay.
So it's basically like, in order to define something, you also have to outline what it isn't.
That makes sense.
And in terms of monsters and things like that, to say, Victor Frankenstein says to the creature, he calls him demon, he calls him all of these names to kind of say, you are not me. And he's abjecting the creature off of himself and saying, look, we're nothing alike. I might keep coming back to works like Dracula and Frankenstein just because they're really good examples of the Gothic, but also situations where you can have a sense of othering in a less supernatural or fantastical environment, something like Aliens, where the ostensible good guys in the movie are the colonial Marines, and the villains, if you look at the movie through the lens of it being a allegory for the Vietnam War, the aliens aren't evil. They're just the native population of this particular area, and they're being shot and blown up and killed and destroyed. But the very fact that they're demons is a byproduct of abjection. But it's in Gothic stories, the abject is confronted in such a way that it reveals something monstrous about ourselves, not to turn the Marines into outright monsters, but to make it feel a lot more like they're in the uncomfortable middle. Like, wait a second, if the Marines are the good guys, then why are they taking this land away from the aliens? Now, to be fair, in Aliens, it's not quite so cut and dry because the aliens are a hostile species that can only exist by being violently parasitic towards humans.
Well, I guess another example would be like Starship Troopers, if we're going to stay on the...
Yeah, absolutely. Like, the only good bug is a dead bug.
Yeah.
But if you stop and think about it, and you're confronting the monster, and you realize that the monster isn't as evil as you think it is, or it isn't just as... It's not black and white, but you realize there are qualities about the monster that aren't just intrinsically bad, and there are qualities about the human characters, or the ostensibly good characters, that are not quite so good. It's effectively a critical device that is meant to change one's point of view so that the waters become muddied. Because that's the reality of the situation. It's not like one side is wholly accurate in any situation. There's multiple points of view, but the point of view of the side that thinks is normally right is thrown into conflict by processing the very thing that they objected to begin with. Because how many people have a chance to actually meet the personified abject? You know, because they're told so often, this is the enemy, you kill them, you destroy them. But what if you said, hey, did you try talking to it? You know, that classic sci-fi trope, try talking to the monster. So many of them never do. So it can be a really traumatic experience, which complicates things. Isn't it so much simpler if it's just cops and robbers, where the robbers are always bad and the cops are always good? But the Gothic doesn't seek to do that. It instills a bit of entropy, a bit of chaos. But the whole point behind that is to do away with the illusion of good versus evil and sort of expose the complexity that real life typically affords. So that's the abject. Then the atmosphere. Atmosphere is a bit complicated because you can have an atmosphere that's creepy. There are some atmosphere types that are very prevalent in Gothic stories.
So just to be clear, some other terms for the atmosphere would be, that you mentioned earlier, would be the Numinous?
Yeah, a numinous atmosphere, a weird atmosphere. You could say sublime, but that's kind of a different school of thought. But those are two fairly Gothic. You could also say a Gothic atmosphere, but you'll notice that the Gothic is an umbrella term. So if you say Gothic, you don't kind of have to specify a bit more. There's nothing wrong with using the term Gothic, but it's vague. And so I actually prefer that kind of vagueness sometimes, because it's like, ooh, well, what does that mean? And it makes you wonder. And then you get to find out along the way instead of just spelling things out right away. So with the numinous is essentially that you're alluding to a divine presence, a divinity, if you will. And Rudolf Otto wrote a work called The Idea of the Holy, where he was looking into the power of the ghost story and horror stories and how they connected to religion and the presence of the wrath of God, or this numen, or godly presence, or numina, which is just the plural of that. So, but in the presence of the numen, you feel numinous sensations, which include torpor, creature feeling. I mean, torpor is just like you're stupefied. Yeah. But creature feeling is the sense of object feeling, like I am but an object that is annihilated before this awesome might. It's basically just you being destroyed in the presence of absolute power, but also unknowable power. And he spoke of something relative to the numinous called the Mysterium Tremendum Fascinans, which is just Latin for the tremendous, mysterious, fascinating force. And more often than not, people just say the Mysterium Tremendum. I don't know why, because you wouldn't say the tremendum. Nobody says that. But he would just refer to it as, the Mysterium Tremendum, which is this tremendous, mysterious force. And this kind of plays into the idea that a lot of Gothic stories are built around mystery or obfuscation. What happened here? Why is everyone dead? Except for this one guy who has appeared to survive. Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? And why is all this wreckage conveying this sense of awesome power? It's very Gothic. And the weird is sort of the Lovecraftian version of that, based off a concept called cosmic nihilism, where it's kind of like the numinous if it existed at a cosmic level, where the Mysterium Tremendum is isolated. Generally, it's not spoken of in cosmic terms because it's like a localized event where in Ghostbusters, when they confront Gozer, I think it was Gozer, the destroyer, the traveler. The traveler has come, choose the form of the destructor. And when they're on top of the building and the doors open up and there's just this sense of like endless space. Now imagine that, but confined to a hallway or a mansion or something that's a little bit more quantifiable. Yeah. And like cosmic nihilism, it's kind of the same idea, but you're actually invoking the cosmos or outer space. Like the notion of this divinity came from outer space.
And it's so incredibly tiny in its...
Yeah, and the sense of shrinking or creature feeling that you feel as a result of being exposed to something from outer space. And, of course, nihilism is, it's promoting this idea of madness or meaninglessness in the face of a cosmic threat, whereas the Mysterium Tremendum is more divine, it's more religious. At least Rudolf Otto's framing of it was through a religious kind of interpretation of things, where the ultimate expression of the numen was felt through like rapture. Yeah. But here's the thing, Gothic rapture exists. There is this sense of goosebumps, or your skin is crawling, like the goosebumps I have on my arm right now, for instance. It's that kind of idea where you're evoking something that's comparable to a religious experience, but it's not, because in my case, I'm an atheist. The numinous is just, is again, just this presence of divinity and mystery and power in a way that could sort of destroy you. It doesn't sound that different from the weird. And what kind of differentiates them is sort of context, or where you're trying to communicate where the feeling came from. Where the numinous is like, okay, it comes from some other world, but that other world is like heaven or hell or just somewhere. You know, it's kind of indistinct or even religious. Whereas the weird and specifically cosmic nihilism, I'm feeling this sense of powerlessness and madness, but it must have come from the stars. You know, and Lovecraft is kind of famous for that.
Yeah.
And when you say weird, that's kind of a marketing term, actually, because Weird Tales was the magazine that Lovecraft published in. But I guarantee you that if it was called Strange Tales, then people would have called it The Strange. You know what I mean? Like, it was literally a marketing thing. But when people say the weird, generally they're referring to stories that were published, because it wasn't just Lovecraft.
Yeah.
The guy who did the Conan stories, I forget his name off the top of my head, Rob Howard, he wrote weird stories too, and the quality was a bit different, and he wasn't quite as scientifically oriented, but they published him because they were gatekeepers of a particular type of sensation or atmosphere. So, and these are very plastic kind of terms. And Jeff Vandermeer, he wrote a book about weird stories, and he had a prologue, and he mentions writers like Lovecraft and contemporaries of him and said, these guys are weird. Well, now we're writing the new weird. So writers like Thomas Ligotti and China Mayville and Jeff Vandermeer. And then he said, he actually finishes the prologue of this collection of new weird stories by saying, well, now the new weird's dead, long live the next weird. Like, it's just kind of like a movement or something like that, where you're constantly shucking off language and finding new ways to describe it. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make by mentioning that is the weird and the numinous aren't so different. You know,
yeah. In fact, I was going to mention that it sounds like the one thing that they both have in common is basically an encounter with something that you can't wrap your head around. It's just
something
too
powerful.
Vast.
It's vast. It's powerful. It causes you to feel helpless. It undoes your sense of reality. Sanity damage.
Yeah.
Right. Now, in the sense of Lovecraft, his characters were often driven irreversibly mad. Like, their madness was like, once they had it, they get sent to the insane asylum, and they spend the rest of their days messed up. Whereas, in the case of someone who undergoes a religious experience, like a deeply religious experience, you could argue that they can come back from that. Now, whether or not there's already something a bit curious about how they view the world to begin with, to experience that is certainly open to debate, because you do have to think about the world in a very particular way to be suspect to some of these feelings. Like, Lovecraft's heroes are always kind of loners. You know, they're highly imaginative characters. They're not everyday men. They're very unusual. And Edgar Allan Poe, same kind of idea, where the people who are most vulnerable to the numinous or Gothic atmosphere have to be able to entertain its effect on them. Because if you just don't respond to it, then you're not going to experience the symptoms of it either. You have to have an open mind. But you're right. Gothic atmosphere tends to invoke a sense of powerlessness, confusion, subjugation. Where it gets kind of fun, though, is that people that like those kinds of stories, that's what they sign up for. That's what they want. You know, if they saw a movie and they didn't feel helpless, if they didn't get that alien queen at the end, that alien menace, that's just making them feel like, oh, I feel like I'm in the presence of something from another world, but it's huge, it's powerful, as big as a house, as big as a castle. I can't quantify it. There's a sense of enormity or scale.
Yeah.
Did we talk about horror and terror at all?
No, I don't think we've gotten to those yet.
Okay. And horror and terror are kind of important just in terms of presentation, because all of the things that we've talked about up to this point, atmosphere, ontology, the uncanny, the abject, can be presented in media, depending on the media type, as horrifying or terrifying. Because normally you're dealing with monsters, or you're dealing with some kind of spooky space, like a castle or a mansion or some of the apartments that I've lived at, that I'm pretty sure at one point in time there was some kind of satanic ritual that took place. But the point being is that you can present these to the audience in various ways. So horror is where you show things to the point that you can't imagine what you're seeing. You just see it. So if the biker in Dawn of the Dead, if he gets pulled off his bike and the zombies surround him and they start pulling out his guts, and they actually used actual offal for that from an abattoir. If that happens, then you can't imagine anything. It's just occurring and you're watching it unfold. Now imagine the same exact scenario, but he was dragged off into the mist and you could hear sounds of him being dismembered and him screaming, or maybe the sound effects guy grabbed a tomato and squeezed it in front of a microphone to give you just enough information to suggest it. And in that case, your imagination goes crazy, and there's really no limit to it because you could imagine it the way that George Romero envisioned it. But when George Romero is being horrifying, he's only giving you the option of his vision of things, as opposed to, okay, we'll just kind of suggest it and then your imagination will go crazy. Some good horror directors, and when I say horror, I mean specifically Gothic horror. It would be David Cronenberg is a really good example where he goes out of his way to gross you out or to shock you. And a good example of someone who's a bit more terrifying might be Stanley Kubrick, where he spends more time making you feel ill at ease or just having sounds in the background to unsettle you. The Blair Witch Project is a really good example of a terrifying film. Nobody calls them terror films, and in America, the term Gothic really doesn't exist, except in a very narrow context. People tend to focus on the ontological side of things, like Scooby-Doo. Oh, there's an old dark castle, which involves Gothic cinema from the 1930s or 40s that really sort of cemented that image of what the Gothic means to an American audience. But then that's all that they think of. When in reality, a lot of these concepts are much more applicable to, media in general. Even something like Spielberg, where he hides the shark in Jaws, that's terror. Whereas showing the shark and it pops out of the water and it chomps down on the ship captain at the end, Captain Shaw. Well, in that movie, it's not the best example because the shark looks fake, It's but imagine if they got the special effects right, and it was actually shocking and gross as opposed to campy. And you can have campy horror too, and that's the idea, is that it doesn't have to be successful. It's more the attempt, especially in horror films. And when a lot of American audiences think of horror movies, their opinion of them isn't always very high. I've given interviews where I've asked, do you like horror films? And they're like, no, horror movies are stupid. But generally they're referring to a very particular type of horror film, something that's kind of schlocky or just ineffectual. But you could just as easily have something that's really disturbing or awful. A random example, I saw a film called The Living, which isn't a horror film, but it has a horrifying scene where the brother of this woman is incensed after she is beaten up by her alcoholic husband. So he hires a hitman, but an actual hitman. And so he drives out, meets the hitman, and they're at a diner. And we're not really sure if this guy is the real deal or not. But then someone at the diner looks at the killer the wrong way, and nothing happens at first. And then the hero of the movie, the employer of the hitman, goes outside, and the killer joins him, and he says, wait in the car, I'll be right back. And then in the background, you can see the killer go back into the diner, and he kills the guy at the counter. But not only that, he kills everyone else inside the diner too. Oof. And the movie forces you to watch all of this. The waitress says, don't kill me, and she raises her hand in front of her face. And the killer shoots through her hand, and the bullet goes into her head, and her brains, exit the back of her head. It's a very horrifying scene. It's horrifying. Just the context of it alone is awful. But the main difference between it being horrifying versus terrifying is that they show you everything. You see the brains exiting the back of her head. You see her asking, please don't shoot me, and he just does it anyways.
Whereas if you stayed in the car, the audience pretty much stayed in the car with the other guy, and just you just heard the shots and screams, that would be
exactly.
terror.
Horror is gory, and terror is more imagination.
What they might call a psychological thriller, maybe sometimes.
Yeah, but generally there's an air of the supernatural, an air of the numinous, the uncanny, the abject. All of these things that we've talked about get swept up into that, and it sort of boils down to the director how uncanny they want their film to be, how ontological they want their film to be. I didn't actually learn what ontology was until I was in grad school. It's not a common term. And a lot of these terms, even though they exist in mainstream media, most people don't know what they are. They don't recognize them. And that's one problem with the Gothic, as far as American audiences go, is that the place of where the Gothic was formed and it kind of came into being was actually Great Britain. And you had Shakespeare and graveyard poets and Jacobean poets and plays from various parts of the early Renaissance leading into the modern sort of period, Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment, and 20th century, where it kind of started in Britain, because the first Gothic novel, what was actually called a Gothic novel, was 1764. What most people sort of credit as being the first one, The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, which would have been before the United States was actually formed in 1776 with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And so you wouldn't even have American authors writing stories like that until later. But there are some examples of early Gothic American novels, but they're different. Yeah. It's not that they don't employ the same techniques, but the way that they employ them is different, And that's true in terms of centuries, too. 20th century Gothic works are very different from 18th century works, even though they make use of the same components. So yeah, that's the Gothic in a nutshell, really. Honestly, we could devote an entire segment of a similar length to what this will be to any one of these topics.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Like the weird or the numinous would totally be my bag, because it's my go-to. Like, if you asked me why I like the Gothic, the numinous is what it's all about. That sense of awesome mystery or power. It doesn't even have to be divine, but Hollow Knight, for instance, the threat at the end of the game is something that you feel throughout the entire experience, is revealed to be a forgotten god. But it's the sun, basically. It's this moth radiance, and it has a crown, and when you fight it, there are these organs playing, and this sense of, like, church-like power. It's this forgotten sort of authority, but it reaches through dreams into reality. Oh, I love it. And yeah.
I'd imagine any really good end boss would evoke the feeling of the numinous.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Mother Brain in Metroid is kind of felt throughout Metroid's a bit tricky, but the idea is that Mother Brain is like this central sort of unit that reaches out into Zebeth, the Metroid homeworld. And it's very annoying when you have an end villain that feels disconnected from the rest of the story. It should be leading up to an explanation to the mystery. Even if it ultimately causes that atmosphere to fade, once you destroy the radiance, the story ends. But here's the interesting thing about it, is if you play through the game again and you know exactly who the villain is, you can still entertain that feeling of mystery.
Yeah.
Because the experiencing of the radiance as a terrifying concept versus a horrifying one where you confront it are two different things. Yeah. It's a different state of experiencing something. So it doesn't do away with the story, but from a narrative standpoint, it's really cool. It's kind of ingrained within the entire story, so it doesn't feel cheap at the end. You're like, oh, well, it was...
Because there's some games where you get to the end boss and it's like, okay, I've leveled up enough, I have the best armor, I have the best weapons, I have plenty of health items, let's go. Whereas there are some end bosses where you get there and, like, from a technical standpoint, you're ready, but just the presentation kind of gives you pause just because of...
Or it affects you, too.
Yeah.
Again, like, the confrontation is kind of traumatic, or you could call it a twist if you wanted to, because it doesn't get any easier knowing who the culprit was in this situation, and sometimes the confrontation itself... Darkest Dungeon has a really great twist where you realize that the ancestor, he's not the main enemy. The enemy is the earth itself. It's this monster deep within the earth, and you have to sacrifice people by sending them to the endless dungeon. And again, it's a Pyrrhic victory. It's Promethean. I totally forgot there's another aspect to the Gothic, the Faustian bargain and the Promethean quest. I suppose maybe we could delve into that next time, but
because I think that's probably getting a little bit more niche in the Gothic, whereas the things we've covered so far seem to be
they're tropes and writing devices, and absolutely, and those are more like sort of devices that are popular, but they don't necessarily have to function in a Gothic way either, because you can have a Faustian bargain that has to do with the guy who sold you your used car, and you want to return it because it's a lemon, but you signed the document and you signed everything away to him. Okay, wow, what a Faustian bargain. But it's not really a Gothic story, there's...
Not unless you go back to return it, but he's gone. And so is the used car lot and everything.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a
Twilight Zone.
The Twilight Zone is kind of Gothic too, even though generally there can be some sci-fi aspects, but it kind of fucks with you mentally.
Yeah.
And
the episodes are typically too short to get too many story elements into them, but I feel like a lot of Twilight Zone could qualify.
Well, and Gothic stories tend to work like that too, where how much story does Metroid have? Like, in terms of, like, how much plot is there? How much lore, how much active lore is there? How much of an active narrative? Because most of it is just the reader interacting with the world themselves, which is why it works so well with video games, I think. And Dark Souls, how much story is there? How much active story? Because most of that is pieced together after people, like, after the story is done, people figure out the story later.
Yeah.
And Silent Hill, same kind of idea. It's all kind of there, but you have to figure it out yourself. And there's a sense of, like, being a detective, except in Gothic stories, what you're engaging with, it's sort of ghastly or ghoulish, or it's tied up in the past, or it's tied up in some of these things that we've talked about.
Right.
Whereas Murder, She Wrote might not be the most Gothic thing of all, because it's so removed from most of the things that we talked about. It's not very uncanny. It's too conventional, and it's just those conventions. Whereas Gothic stories have conventions, but then they play off of all of these other things that are much more quintessentially Gothic. Like, they're uncanny, they're abject, they're atmospheric, they're ontological, they're horrifying and terrifying. Whereas Agatha Christie and Poirot, he's basically her version of Sherlock Holmes, where they're just murder stories.
Yeah.
Whereas if you read The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is a Sherlock Holmes adventure, there's Gothic elements in that in particular, but it's not like it's just, you think of Sherlock Holmes and they're all like that. And same idea with Murder, She Wrote, where you might have one episode that was kind of spooky. So if people listening to this walk away from this, the one thing they can conclude is that, or the one thing that we've taught them, if anything, is that Murder, She Wrote isn't super Gothic. But in certain ways, conventionally, it is. Like the female detective, stuff like that, the trope, the mystery, it's up to What's-Her-Face to figure out what's happened. But in terms of, like, how much does it actually affect you in a Gothic way? Not very. It's a lot of the conventions without a lot of the actual, like, interesting modal
It's
kind
got
of
the
stuff.
spices without the main ingredients.
I don't know. I almost feel like it has the stock, but not the spice. Because the spice is what makes you recognize it, where the stock is just kind of like, you could add anything to it. You know what I mean?
Okay. So I was thinking, like, the main ingredients being, like, the abject, the numinous, the things we were talking about before.
No. Because again, it's a modal exercise where you're applying them to the Gothic is something that you add to the normal.
Okay.
Like, it's a supplement.
Right.
That's how I view it. Like, it's impossible to have something that's just, like, pure uncanny. Like, the uncanny is something that you feel relative to a situation. It's
Fair.
not the situation itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, same abject can't really happen in a vacuum either.
Yeah. You need a situation to be abject, not for... It's a quality to a situation.
Yeah.
And the Gothic at large is like that. You know, it's a quality, but there are qualities that make up just that larger umbrella term. So, and as we do more of this, I think we could talk about each one of those. Just have a whole episode dedicated to the abject, and that'll be fun. I think. For sure. Yeah. So that's that's the Gothic. And just to kind of rattle them off again here, you have the ontological, you have the uncanny, you have the abject, you have atmosphere, you have horror and terror, and then you have writing tropes like the Faustian bargain or the Promethean themes, things like that. And then other tropes like live burial, incest, doubling, which is usually a kind of uncanny, but...
or like the shadow facing off against the shadow self kind of thing. Or the...
like the hero facing off against like their dark self. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, totally. And we can talk about that in regards to maybe the abject or the uncanny. Yeah. So yeah, that's the Gothic, folks.
Well, thanks for listening.
Yeah, and stay tuned for more of these. I don't know how often we're gonna do them, but until next time.